Hey Brobots, and welcome to what I feel is my best effort yet on reaching my ultimate goal of showing you exactly how I produce the finish on my models. Coming up on 2 years of making videos has given me the confidence to go deeper into the techniques and strategies I use, so if I may be so bold, I'd like to call today's video my first attempt at a masterclass level of depth on chipping for a Maschinen Krieger model, in this case the MK44 AMMOknight. I'd like to make mention that this would not have been possible without you. Your support empowers me to take on new projects. I'm getting more confident now to take on bigger and more complicated projects, as well as fast ones to show you speed techniques as well. Thanks guys, let's get going. Setting up my wet palette, I've arranged it with the darkest colors from the top, starting with Ammo by MIG Matte Black, followed by Ammo Chipping, and then lastly at the bottom there, I've got Vallejo Camo Black Brown. Yes, they intermix just fine, and I like the tonal variations between these colors and brands. The ammo stuff tends to have a slightly red tone, and the Vallejo has a slightly yellow to my eyes. Now let's set up some quick mixes here on our palette. A little bit into this one, the same, make a darker mix. And that way, right from the beginning, I can have 3 ages of chips. Straight black, a very slight mix, it's just got a little bit of black in it, and then the Vallejo chipping color as well. And as I move along, I may intermix them just a little bit more. So like this one, we could make a mix like this. That one's just ever so slightly mixed now. And that just gives us different ages of chips. More chips is better. The poke through. Here I can show you some close-ups of some examples with a poke through. Now there's nothing on my brush, I'm just using it as a pointer instead of my fat finger. Can you see that's the very first layer of paint exposed just here, here and here. Now I've not done anything to remove paint, I've just simply left that during my painting processes. I've not covered it up. And it's not an accident, I've done that fully aware that in the future that will appear as a chip. I mean, in a way, it has kind of chipped through. It's not being covered up during with other paint during the process. It's also quite obvious here on the faceplate. None of those chips so far have been painted on over the top. All of those chips here are simply the base mahogany spray can being allowed to poke through. Let's search for another one for you. Here as well, these chips so far are all poke through. And although the videos are not my best quality because they're coming up on being, what, they're 18 months old, the earlier video steps of this model, I show you how to leave those. In the future, with my videography skills increasing, I'll go back and redo some topics like this to give you a better view of how to do that. I've included links to both of these previous steps below for your convenience. These are from before I even started Patreon, so quite nostalgic, and thank you very much for helping me improve my videos so much. Here at the bottom edge of the feet you can see quite a few poke throughs. They're very subtle. I've been careful to not completely cover them up, but they do look like underlying paint bruises and damage. The poke through. Thanks to the amazing improvements Hasegawa have put into their engineering process, I was able to keep this model in components, so these weren't glued together. A lot of other parts I glued, these ones were not. And that was to help facilitate some of these weathering processes and to make it easier to show you via video. The wide fence brush technique. That's a gag that my mate Ryan San Pedro often likes to use. I'll use quite wide brushes. This is a Tamiya modeling brush HF number 2, and I buy them in little sets. They're quite reasonable, it's a synthetic brush, and I'll use it for the initial stage, again with part of my methodology of 2 of the main themes I try to hit is less but better, and the next one will be to start loose and finish tight, as we do in other forms of art. I'll start off with the largest brush possible in the beginning, and then work down the gradient, going towards a smaller brush at the end. I understand that some people have the idea to start off with the fine brush first, but I don't think that's the most efficient way we can do it. It's like trying to clean your bathroom with a toothbrush. You might want to do it, but it's probably not the best idea. I'll go with a relatively dark color this time, say the black mix, and put it on the brush. Much like with the dry brush technique, I'll then remove most of the paint like this. I don't want it too heavy on there. Working here from the edges of the feet, I'll bring the brush upwards against the areas to help demarcate the outline. Coming in with the brush and moving against. Shadows go up. I'll go against a line like this and put some edging work on here to simulate damage against the sides. A couple across the top here. At this stage, I'm developing a mental plan of attack. I'm looking very deeply at my model. That's actually why I've gone quiet during this stage, is that I can't paint and develop this kind of strategy at the same time. So as I'm looking around the model, I'm evaluating everything, and I'm starting to think about laying a foundation and framework, basis, a plan, on which I will develop more and more of the heavier chips. Now you'll be able to, please keep that in mind as you watch the tutorial, you'll see that I start developing the chips along these lines. Also, by having a wetter brush, we can deposit much larger chips like this. We need to be careful of this approach because too many of these will be very obvious and show that we were using our brush like a stamp. So let's be careful. There we go. And I'll come back in further steps, subsequent steps, to further blend that into the model and add both realism through variation. Using the wide brush fence again, on a very obvious to damage area. And the kneecaps. Watching this back with you, it is a little embarrassing that my English totally falls apart when I'm in deep thought mode. But I consider that actually a good thing. You can see that I don't go through this process flippantly. I'm really thinking about it. I'm concentrating deeply on where these chips should go. So when I've needed to talk over the top, you can tell these are very, what I would consider important steps. And I'm giving it a great deal of thought. Like, look at it in here. I've decided to go with a triple there. I know that that can be a very cool focal point off to the right of the exhaust system. Here is one of the money shot chips. And you'll see that this took, say, 3 or 4 steps over the course of this video to develop this chip. And I think it's one of the coolest parts of the model. It's really a money shot chip. Now for spongering today, I'm going to do a 2-step process. I'm going to use a little bit of this and a little bit of that. First round, because this is a largish model, I'm going to go with a cellulose sponge, and you can get these in the makeup section from a pharmacy. Here in close-up, you can see that the cellulose sponge is much coarser. It has a much rougher texture than the standard sponge that most people will probably use on the Wright. And I'll be using that in a second stage later. Snip off a slice. And we're good to go. Continuing on from our work yesterday, I've made a mix here. I've got matte black up here at the top. I've got chipping color here below, and then a mix of 50-50 here on the wet palette. Using the 50-50 mix, wiping some of the excess off on a paper towel, let's start working it in and blending it into some of these patches that we have on the model like this. I've got a couple of extra notes here to add over the top as Linc Primary goes into deep contemplation mode on his chips there. I specifically cut this sponge into this shape with the plan in mind of using that frontal aspect of it to develop the longitudinal axis chips that look like large dragging scratches, as if the suit had moved through an abrasive environment, and to help give the suit the idea of movement, giving it some horizontal forward speed, because it's a very static posed model and there's nothing you can do about it. It's articulated, I mean it moves, but basically you could imagine you can only put it in the standing pose. So that was a really important thing here. Now I'm also using the pre-existing chips and layering around them going over the top sometimes, but also adding extra ones to it. Quite a few things happening here, but most important thing I wanted to point you at was that I used the primary frontal part of this sponge. We could have used other aspects of it, but we can probably do that in a different shaped model in the future that has a different theme for us. Now straight chipping color. A slightly heavier mix over the top. Really work these edges. Translation. I've used the Ammo by MIG chipping color here in a relatively straight fashion. It's not diluted, and I've used it as a heavier overcoat to layer over some of the sponges in an attempt to give them an apparently older aspect due to having oxidized. Here is probably the best example I captured of showing how the cellulose sponge produces a different scratch, both in terms of size and texture. By using the inside of the piece rather than an edge and pushing it into the piece we're weathering, you can see that it's developed fine and slightly jagged scratches rather than the usual dots that we achieve with the fine sponge. Most interesting and perfect for a larger, heavily weathered model like the MK44. Here, using the flat surface of the larger sponge is also producing a fine and interesting effect. I quite liked it. As the paint dried, you can see that we could do finer and finer chips here towards the end. That's really nifty to know. Okay, here we go, the money shot chips. Here are the chips that sell this finish, the money shot chips. These chips and the streaks and effects that originate from them help define the finish and provide focal points for us to believe that it could be real. Using the sponge's pointy end, let's use it to produce the foundation for a running chip and scratch, and control the placement with pinpoint precision. Double tap for extra emphasis and go in reasonably wet with this stage. Oh, look at this one. There we go. Boom. Money shot. Oh yeah, that's good. Another one right in place. There we go. A good longitudinal one, so he scratched it as he was walking along. Brilliant. It's quite wet too. You can see I've added quite a bit of the larger scale chips to the model. There's the next step, and that was all done with the large scale spongering. Now for one more round, I'm going to scale it down and go with small scale spongering. I've pinched off a small piece of sponge here to use. On a larger model, this will be a final spongering step, but on a smaller model, you could go with these first. Using the same paint mixes from before, might freshen it up a little bit. Some chipping color, some matte black. Go with the darker ones first. And then wiping some excess off on paper. Let's carefully work around the edges. Getting a feel for both how much paint is on the sponge, but also to keep it nice and randomized. Small freshies. After marking out our major money shot chips, think of this step as a way to flesh out the details, provide backup and fine detail. You can see that I've gone with a slightly darker mix here to give the idea of fresher chips and provide more contrast due to the reduction in scale. This is not a big deal, but it's these small improvements and details to your finish that our eyes and brains read as interesting and provide another layer of realism. Working the paint on the sponge from fresh will give us a slightly larger, rounder chip, and over the few minutes carrying out this work, the paint will dry, giving us a natural progress down to the fine scratches and dots. Again, I try to work with the properties of the paint rather than against it for a more productive workflow. As my darker mix ran out and dried on the sponge, I reloaded the sponge, the same one. I kept going with it. I was very happy with the shape and pattern with straight Ammo by MIG chipping. It's a lighter color, and I think it's a very good one to represent things like oxidization, oxidized metal. It's quite a red brown color, and I'm layering those over the top of the darker chips in an attempt to give them an apparent age difference. The red chips will tend to look older because it's given them time to oxidize, and it looks more interesting to go from a darker foundation and then work up through the color gradient and start to produce lighter color chips. Now, working around, showing you the entirety of the model here, you can see I'm working around different areas and examining it very closely. This is part of the process. I do know that I see some people that will work the parts entirely by themselves. I've done that more for demonstration purposes. Here is my usual workflow that I like to look at the model as a whole. I emphasize that a lot during my tutorials. We display the models finished, so I like to work on them finished so I can have an idea of its overall impact. I want the model to look cool overall rather than just in select places. So looking at balance, overall integrity of the chips, and giving it a better read overall. And I think this is just a very self-educational step to go through to make sure that you're keeping the model cohesive and not giving it the same finish overall everywhere. That's the best way to ruin something. Our eyes will instantly see that if you've got a similar finish over everything. Our eyes and our brain become bored, and it's a death knell for a weathered finish. Let's take our time now to augment and upgrade some of the foundation chips that we've provided before. The sponge I'm working with now, it's quite wet, so you can see it's giving me that good, it's a slightly round sort of chip, so I know I can do that, layer that over some of these, the ones that I was calling the longitudinal type scratches there, to increase their volume. You can stretch out chips and you can make them wider, or you can just add volume there. So there I know I'm going to make a detail point at the rear of the model. Here I really liked it. I stretched out this money chip on top to make it into a real focal point. This has really become one of my favorite places on the model, the Pointy Brush. Reviewing the footage, and I noticed something that I have not made mention of before in a video. I don't think I was conscious of it. I hold my breath when taking careful shots with my brush when doing the very fine detail work. This may sound an unusual analogy, but if anyone has been involved with precision shooting, one of the techniques to get into the zone and produce both a stable and replicable stance is to shoot from the same breath pattern as possible. In my case, I take in half a breath, hold, and then expel after my shot, or brushstroke in this case. I noticed I do exactly the same breath pattern when making careful brush strokes. Half breath in, paint the strokes, carefully exhale, and prepare for the next strokes by washing out and reloading the brush. With paint in this case. Exactly the same, but quite different. If you are having trouble with your precision brush strokes, it might be something you can experiment with to help fix your painting position for very short periods of time and work from a stable platform. Just remember to breathe after your painting shot, okay? Now, a couple of tactical notes on using the Pointy Brush. I believe this is one of the things that newer people to painting weathering first pick up on. They see all the cool scratches on the model, and of course it's something that they want to immediately emulate, and that produces what I generally call the angry ant finish, in that they tend to paint a lot of very similar shaped and sized chips on the model in very obvious places, and it looks like a chain of ants walking around their model. Or if you've ever used the capture or some of the ways to set up an outline on something in Photoshop, I think one of them is called ants, right? It very much looks like that kind of thing. So coming here, this one, I believe I actually got rid of that chip there because I thought it was a little bit samey to the rest of the model. But what I wanted to overemphasize in a way, I wanted to take this as far as I could and put in a lot of movement scratches on this guy. So using a 50-50 mix here of Ammo by MIG black and the Ammo chipping color, so a very black, red, water-based acrylic paint mix, I've gone in and painted a number of longer scratches here, but working very carefully to keep them as randomized as possible. Now you could see there I did a kind of double. I did a longer streak, and then I've touched it up with the wetness still on the brush to add the depth effects to it. I'll often like to To give more of an indication of movement, paint a longer chip and then some dots on either end of it. And wait a minute, coming up for a reload. So speaking about angry ants, this is probably the time in the video when I have to mention my much often repeated let's use restraint, because it's a really overdone technique, especially on this model. I'm super guilty of it myself in this case, but I thought one of my themes for the AMMOknight is going too far. If there's anything in the Maschinen Krieger universe that we can take too far, it's definitely this one. This model was designed and painted, the artwork, when Yokoyama-san was probably at the angriest period in his career. It's right when he'd basically been had the big fight with Hobby Japan's president, and they were trying to steal his work. So as an artist, you know, he's quite a passionate guy. He was absolutely livid. So if we're going to take something too far, the AMMOknight and the Robot Battle 5 property is the one we should try it out on. Oh, really quick side note, sorry to interrupt, Linc. I wanted to make mention that I thought of this scratch as a facial scar, kind of like a dueling scar. A super quick example here, this is a small fail. There's obviously just not enough paint on the brush. See, it's quite thin, and when it evaporates, it's gone. So, reload. Okay, back with a loaded brush. Model in shot and focused. Half breath in and... boom! Breathe out. Oh. Nailed it. Okay, and do that lots. Thanks for watching that through with me, guys. Hope you both enjoyed it and that it made sense and is useful for you. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have here within the Patreon app, in our private Discord chat room, and even save them up for our Discord live hangout, which currently I'm planning to offer once a month as a bonus feature for my supporters. Along with those places, you can also put questions and ideas to our amazing Paint on Plastic community in our Facebook group if you happen to use that platform. Many of us are there, but please let me point out that it's grown quite large now, over 3,000 plus members, so if you'd like to get a response from me personally, go ahead and tag me and I'll get back to you. That's another bonus I offer to my supporters. I'm trying to limit my time on social media so that I can concentrate on doing the deep work for you in making really awesome models and video tutorials, so I try to only visit our various platforms once a day. Thanks again, guys. Next tutorial will be on oil dot technique, where we can learn to oil dot all the things. Thanks, guys. See ya. Linc. Big thanks to Hobbyco and Little Robot. I do my best to buy from and support local to keep our money in our communities and to empower events. Huge shout out to the Rocket Punch Robot team. Ivan, MB, Grant, Con, Jack, RJ, Simon, Robert, Kelso, Kevin, David, Derek, Alan and Nilos. This episode was supported by our patrons. Your support empowers me and makes all this happen. Thanks, guys.